If you rejected riots are the voice of the unheard, unquote, as leftist justification and sympathy for the violent riots of BLM and Antifa, then you don't get to use it as justification for conservative violence in storming the US Capitol. By the way, that's contrary to conservative principles. But yeah, if you rejected this kind of mentality that violence is the voice of the unheard when it came to leftist Marxist BS, then you don't get to use it to justify your own. And on the flip side, oh dear radical leftists, sympathizers of Marxism and sympathizers of radical leftist violence who turned a blind eye when Marxists, Antifa, BLM, domestic terrorists did this and worse for months on end and you didn't bat an eye. You too are in no place to complain, for you've set the precedents. You set the precedents for extremists. For decades, the radical left has taken over academia, the media, pop culture, and glorified this sort of behavior when it's on the left. So don't be surprised when you have nutcases on the right doing the same thing. You set the same precedents. If you don't want radical violence against civilians, if you don't want domestic terrorism, you need to condemn it across the board. Across the board. Acts of violence perpetrated against non-combatants, whether they be people who you agree with, whether they be against people who you disagree with. Acts of violence against non-combatant individuals is terrorism, is illegal, and should be punished with the highest penalty possible for the sake of civility and a peaceful society. You are not enlightened if you engage in or sympathize with politically motivated violence, any sort of ideologically motivated violence, and of course, it goes without saying, any kind of unjust violence against civilians, vandalism against property. This is the definition of terrorism. And, before you go throwing stones in glass houses and pointing out specks in the eyes of others when you have logs in your own, this is already condemned by the majority, virtually all conservative voices. Completely unlike what occurred when radical leftists were doing the same thing for months. Yes, they even stormed Capitol buildings in the U.S., albeit not the U.S. Capitol as far as I recall, but engaged in even more violence. And the leftist media and leftist politicians didn't bat an eye. To the contrary, they called it a peaceful protest. So in the meantime, before you continue to left-splain conservatives and Republicans and others you disagree with by generalizing all conservatives and Republicans and further pouring fuel on a fire that the radical left started, before you engage in your own continued bigotry by generalizing all people and lumping them as one in order to justify this sort of violence becoming a back and forth, just be a little consistent and call it a peaceful protest. But no, it'd be rather to be consistent and call violence out, call terrorism out for when it is. Whether it's on the left, the right, or anywhere in the middle, whether it's a blue person, a green person, white or black. Inconsistency is the hallmark of falsehood. Call it out when you see it. Don't be a hypocrite. We're no different than animals if we throw away our principles. There will be violence, and some violence is justified. There will be violence and continued violence, greater violence, if we don't change things in this country and in the world. But yeah, some violence is justified. But not against civilians, not against non-combatants, but in a noble and dignified, orchestrated and self-controlled manner. That's what we have militaries for. That's what we have armies for. And if push comes to shove, it's going to be military, police power, gun power that puts an end to this violence. Be consistent. Try to be as rational and as logically consistent as you can. Don't be a hypocrite. Yalla bye.